As reported by Annette Scott in Farmers Weekly this week, the investigation has been launched following claims of the European countries dumping surplus frozen potato products on the New Zealand local market. If you're unfamiliar with this story, COVID-19 brought about a surplus of potatoes in the European countries such as the Netherlands, and they looked to countries to offload them, of course having devastating impacts on our local New Zealand potato industry. The Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment has launched this investigation into what Potatoes New Zealand says is proving a threat to the surplus fries being imported here into this country. So in September, Potato New Zealand's filed an anti-dumping tariff application saying it was it was a threat to the billion-dollar potato industry. And Chris Claridge joins us from Potatoes New Zealand now. Evening, Chris. What progress have we made since we spoke last?
Good evening, Sarah. We've made good progress, and the industry is relieved that the government has taken the action that they have. We believed and saw very early on that there was a significant threat to our industry of, as you correctly state, frozen fries being dumped in the New Zealand market from Europe because of the lockdown in Europe. What happened very quickly was that the Europeans were unable to adjust their planting, so they ended up with a surplus of potatoes and a surplus of frozen fries. And our concerns were that they were going to be dumped in the market. Our concerns came true, and we actually got evidence of them being dumped in the market. And we saw in June of this year a significant increase in exports from Europe to New Zealand. And we saw that those fries are being sold at, we believe, below cost. We gathered the evidence we had and put it in front of the government in September. And quite rightly, they've said there's a case to answer here, and there's grounds for further investigation. And now what happens is MB, the Ministry of Business, Enterprise and Innovation, Business, Employment, and I always get them slightly confused, Business,
Innovation and Employment.
That's the one, MB. Yep. That's the one. Yeah, it's quite a mouthful. I just call them MB. And they've launched an official investigation. Now, there's a few firsts in this, I'd have to say, Sarah, but we're very relieved. There is still a significant threat. And that threat, by the way, is in other sectors and not just potatoes.
So let's continue to expand. What will some of those firsts be, and what could it lead to for other particular product categories going into the future to protect us from this anti-dumping type of behaviour?
Well, first things first, we absolutely believe in free trade. We believe in the free movement of goods and services around the world, but there is domestic legislation that we've got here in New Zealand, which is absolutely in line with WTO rules, that prevents the predatory activities of one country on another. In other words, you can't subsidise your production in one country and then export it to another. You can't launch into another country and heavily discount. And also, the third thing is you can't dump large volumes onto another country's market. Those three actions, any of those three actions can result in tariffs being applied at the border. Now, it's under those three sort of areas that we applied to the Crown to say, look, this is a problem. And they've said, yes, there is evidence here of it happening. We need to investigate further. Now, this particular act has been around since 1988. It's the Countervailing and Duties Act. So this legislation's been around for a long time. So we're merely using what's already there, domestic legislation, well established, to prompt the government into undertaking an investigation, which they've correspondingly done.
Where are the shortcomings within our systems to be able to react faster? Because I feel like that was the real problem.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one. And to be fair, MB are going to review their processes. We're apparently one of the first group of companies, and I've got to go into a little bit of technical detail here, but please bear with me, because the way you use the Act and tariffs and for tariffs against dumping is that the people in the marketplace have to go to the Crown and say, look, we're being unfairly treated here. So in our case, because the potato industry is in a unique position, we represent not only potato growers, but potato processors who have brands. So we've basically got the buyers and the sellers in the room. So we could use this act and apply to get dumping investigating because we represented the processors who have the brands in the marketplace. Historically, other product groups or producer groups who only represent growers couldn't do that. And that's what happened in the case of pork, when the pork industry got decimated, because the pork industry couldn't actually apply to get tariffs in place. The processors can, but the growers can't. So there's a little bit of using the tools appropriately and being structured appropriately to be able to do the work. Because of the deregulation in the 80s, they cut up the producer boards, which meant that there's been a slight weakening of the domestic industry to be able to respond using the tools at our disposal. Interesting point.
Yes.
So other sectors are seeing this and starting to react.
What if we have a rise in foreign ownership of our processors here in this country, and therefore they don't want to react because there's a bit of
that's a really good point. Now, in our case, we have McCain's is one of our processors who assisted in the application, and they're foreign owned. So usually the foreign owned companies here will still try and protect the markets that they're in. Now, the other bit is the companies that we helped coordinate the application, they do so also import frozen products from offshore. Let's make this really clear. It's just that the Dutch and the Belgium were so aggressive in their price pointing that they were basically going to target the New Zealand market and wipe us out almost overnight. And that might sound like that's a bit unusual, but here's the numbers. Europe exports in 1 month around about 350,000 metric tons of frozen tries. We produce in 1 year 150,000 tons. So in 2 weeks of Europe's normal exports, they can export enough for our entire year's production and demand. So what EU can do is very much drive our industry under very, very quickly. Now, interestingly, other sectors are starting to pick up similar threats. Forestry is reporting this. Wood processors are reporting. Cheese producers have started to talk about it. And as well, we've seen evidence of dumping worldwide of other skim milk out of the EU. So these are all a function of COVID. It's just that Potatoes New Zealand got organised quickly. Yes, the process is a bit slow, but we're in the process now. It's going to be 6 months of investigation, and then the Crown makes a decision of whether it's in the public interest to impose tariffs.
And this comes back to my absolute point at the start around that we've lacked a sense of nationalism and we're against the fight for it globally, is the fact that New Zealand consumers will welcome cheaper food. And yet they'll still apply tougher regulations on our own domestic producers.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point. And we believe, again, in free trade and that consumers should have choice. And absolutely, we are not against the imports, so long as they play by the rules and so long as they abide by standard international trade practices. In this case, they simply haven't. And we know that because we're seeing what they're doing in other export markets. So the Belgium and the Dutch are actively targeting the Southern Hemisphere markets that haven't had a problem because of COVID lockdowns. Now that's going to happen in other sectors and it's going to happen in other products. So this is not something that's going to go away. It's going to continue. There's a lot of disruption in the supply chain at the moment. And you're seeing that with the goods, free flow of goods are being interrupted.
What type of conversations are you having at a high level? I mean, Minister for Agriculture is also now wearing Minister for Trade hat. That's positive.
It would be fair to say that the action that Potatoes New Zealand took is some product groups find it a little bit unusual because in the case of other product groups which have got a heavy skew to exports, they don't like the idea of their export markets in any way being undermined, and they're concerned about possible retaliation actions where the Europeans might decide, because they don't have access to sell frozen fries into New Zealand, and there's somehow their exports here are hindered, that they'll take retaliatory action and they'll target our lamb and our beef and our other red meats into Europe, as a case in point. They're not allowed to do that. It's simply against the rules. And I would say it's probably, if they're going to do that and use potatoes, frozen fries, as an excuse to have a go at the red meat being exported into Europe, I'd say that's probably an indication they don't really want it there anyway. So, they could use us as the excuse, but we are playing by the rules. We're not doing anything that you're not allowed to do. An industry can stand up for itself and say, look, this is not on. And remember that free trade doesn't mean no rules. That's a key message here.
And I think I wish that playing by the rules saw New Zealand soar, but as Trump has said, throwing your toys out of the cot gets you a lot further. And that's the scary part of the global economy that we do play in and rely so heavily in. Chris, thank you so much for bringing such light on so many topics there. And our thoughts continue to go out to the New Zealand potato growers who are doing it tough. I proudly have 2 boxes of Oakley's brand new spuds, which I had some just before I come in for our dinner. Absolutely beautiful. Keep up the fantastic work, and what you're doing and leading the way for the industry is absolutely amazing. Hey, thank you so much, Chris Claridge, CEO for Potatoes New Zealand there.
This is Sarah's Country.